For me, I just think transporting the action to Ethiopia so that we can actually hear the perspective of a British aid worker working on the front lines of this crisis comes so close to realising what it is that this show ought to be doing with its storytelling, it just doesn't quite get there. Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Joe and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I am a professional theatre critic and a content creator here on social media. And this is my YouTube channel where I review the shows that I have been invited to go and see, as well as bringing you news, interviews, theatre-going vlogs, and all kinds of stagey content. Today, we are going to be talking about Just for One Day, the brand new musical currently premiering at the Old Vic Theatre in London, and it tells the story of Live Aid. Now, if you don't know what Live Aid is somehow, then don't worry, I'm going to clear all of that up for you when I talk about this show's plot and context. But needless to say, this is one of the year's most hotly anticipated new musicals, not just because of its subject matter, but also because this represents a collaboration between many of the UK's most influential and significant producers. But with that also comes a tremendously weighty responsibility to tell an important and nuanced story, and today I'm going to be letting you know whether I thought they managed to do that successfully. So I will be bringing you all of my thoughts about Just for One Day in this video, talking about the music, talking about the plot, talking about the performances, and talking about what it is exactly that a Live Aid musical ought to be. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews coming very soon. And if you have already seen Just for One Day at the Old Vic Theatre, please comment with all of your thoughts down below. What did you think of this show? For now though, let me tell you what I thought of Just for One Day. So the show's title, Just for One Day, comes from a lyric from the David Bowie song Heroes, which is one of the many songs performed at Live Aid, a major 1985 concert that took place simultaneously across 2 continents, with performances in the UK and in Philadelphia in the US, and involved, at the time, the biggest rock artists in the world, participating in this major, unruly undertaking to raise awareness and raise money for a growing world crisis, a famine in Ethiopia. This came on the heels of Band-Aid, a charity supergroup single founded by Bob Geldof and Midge, which had the same aims and fundraising for the crisis. All of which is chronicled and documented in the musical Just for One Day. This tells the story of Live Aid from various different perspectives, but largely from the perspective of Sir Bob Geldof. Geldof, who was an Irish singer-songwriter turned political activist. He was the frontman for the Boomtown Rats in the late 1970s. And over the course of this show, he awakens to the tragedy and the senseless loss of life taking place in Ethiopia due to the famine, and he begins various attempts to try and rectify this from afar using his celebrity platform. And though his is predominantly the perspective through which we see this story, there are also other characters involved. We meet Suzanne, who recalls having been at Live Aid as a very enthusiastic teenager. We see her both in the present and then in the past, played by 2 different performers. And the initial storytelling and narration of the events themselves are born out of a sort of a timeless, abstract conversation between Suzanne, Geldof, and a third character, one who is representing the next generation, one who is young in today's Britain, who recalls Live Aid as a chapter of British history that she's learned about in school. She, being a modern character, has a different political ideology and has no idea what cassette tapes are. We also hear from a British aid worker on the front lines dealing with the crisis in Ethiopia. We also hear from Geldof's collaborator Midge, and though various other recording artists are mentioned and invoked during this 2-act musical, the rest of them aren't necessarily portrayed specifically. And that has a little bit to do with how the music is used in this show. So this, as you might expect, is a jukebox musical that uses the music which is synonymous with the Live Aid concert. There is a lot of Queen, and there is a lot of The Police, and there's so many others, just so many great songs. There's Bowie and Bob Dylan and Elton John and Madonna and The Who. And while occasionally these are performed diegetically within the context of reenacting the Live Aid concert, for the most part, they are reinterpreted as ways to tell the story, or ways to expand on the emotions of different moments in the telling of this story. For example, the song Message in a Bottle is used to convey the Ethiopian famine crisis. When they're singing, I'll send an SOS to the world, it comes at a moment when the Live Aid idea is building momentum because Geldof has visited Ethiopia and seen the devastation for himself and is mobilized to do something more powerful about it. Of course, we also hear the Band Aid single itself, Do They Know It's Christmas, which is performed as they are writing it and then subsequently as they are recording it. More on that later. But even in the context of the Live Aid concert, when these songs are performed, the artists are, like I said before, invoked but not specifically portrayed. We have this gloriously talented ensemble cast who don't play specific artists like Bowie or Madonna. Instead, they just kind of capture their essence, the result of which is a celebration of the music itself and the emotions that it stirs up without feeling like a specific biopic, which I think is probably a smart choice. It does also allow us to transplant some of the music to other situations in the show, because a lot of this plot takes place before the Live Aid concert, which doesn't even begin until we're well into the second act. One such example is another character who does feature in the show who I haven't mentioned to you yet, the then British Prime Minister, the controversial Margaret Thatcher, who's something of a clownish comedy character in this show, performs various songs, the campest of which is Elton John's I'm Still Standing, which is exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. So that gives you a sense of what this show actually is about. As the Live Aid concert is coming together and looming, we follow Geldof's indecision, we follow a young Suzanne trying to get tickets, and we see the impact that Geldof's activism has on her as a fan. And all the while we cut back to this contemporary perspective from someone who is young today looking back on this with perhaps a certain amount of criticism. All of which begins to feel like a very carefully balanced way of telling this story. But there is still one perspective, an important perspective, that we don't really hear from. But before I tell you about that, let me tell you what I enjoyed about this show. So I want to be very clear here. There is a level on which you can not only enjoy this show, but love this show and have a fantastic evening at the theatre. And a lot of that is because of the music. The music is just so incredibly well put together. This cast, these voices, some of the strongest in the West End, just phenomenal talents down to the last in this ensemble, and I'm going to tell you about them individually later on. But it's everyone involved in the music team here who deserves celebration. Patrick Hurley, the musical director, Gareth Owen on sound, Charlie Hughes-Dieth, the vocal coach, every single member of that band who were rocking out for their lives. This music demands unadulterated passion and enthusiasm and commitment, and it's so iconic that the audience will know if you're getting this wrong or if you're doing this half-heartedly, and so much life is brought to it. Then we get to Matthew Brind, who is the musical supervisor and also credited with the arrangements and the orchestrations, so many of which just blew me away completely. I was gasping into a smile multiple times throughout this show because of the way that they utilized music, the way that they layered different pieces of music together. In the post-Glee world, we would call it a mashup. As we're montaging through the Live Aid concert itself in the second act, there is such a skillful medley of Don't You Forget About Me and Rebel Rebel and Good Vibrations that's just joyously great. Also, the way that the music is reconceived theatrically in the first act, the way that it's reinterpreted for Thatcher, the vocal arrangements in Let It Be, which is our finale, the new orchestrations on My Generation towards the end that give it this more modern and contemporary feel. It's just so good. The music work in this show is just astonishing. And if you like jukebox shows, you feel almost guaranteed to have a fantastic time at this. But not only that, so often I find myself saying in these reviews that the music felt a little incongruous to the story, and I think all of the songs were deployed very well throughout this storytelling. I think the way that the music was utilized throughout the show was great. I didn't realise I actually have the names of the musicians here. I want to mention all of them because I always talk about the cast members, I never talk about the musicians, which is wrong. So Patrick Hurley, musical director, joined by Rachel Murphy, Nathaniel Adamson, Joe Evans, Matt Isaac and Kobe Pham. Hats off. All of them. So good. I could keep talking about this at length. However, this is a theatrical show and a piece of storytelling, and there are other dimensions that we need to consider. So I told you there was a level on which you could enjoy it, and that's a perfectly valid level. That's not a wrong takeaway, because Geldof's story and the story of young people who were there, these are stories that are absolutely worthy of being told and worthy of being staged. The work that was done to raise this awareness remains inspirational, and it's an uplifting story, and it's a powerful story, and it connects so meaningfully to many people in the audience who will have memories of what this meant to them at the time, maybe who were even there. And within the scope that it has, the book written by John O'Farrell does a great job in conveying that story. My only issue with all of this is I feel like there's a story beneath the story that we have a responsibility to tell, but we don't. Let me tell you exactly what I mean by that. So here's the thing, without taking away from what a fantastic story this is and what a fantastic achievement this was by Geldof and by everyone involved, the whole idea of Live Aid was in response to this massive humanitarian crisis, to this famine in Ethiopia. And for us to focus largely on Geldof's perspective and on Geldof's story, for me, and though they were clearly making attempts not to do this, it sort of eclipsed the real issue at hand, to the point that it started to feel a little bit white saviorish, which I know is something that they were conscientiously trying to avoid, hence bringing in other perspectives, hence bringing in, you know, a Gen Z perspective that challenged Geldof a little bit, which I have thoughts about. But for me, the missing element here was actually the perspective of anyone who suffered during this crisis or who really experienced this crisis. And we travel across to Ethiopia and we get to hear from a British aid worker working with the individuals affected by this crisis, distributing food in the midst of this famine. And while that again is important, it still feels like we're missing the point just a little bit. The fact that we're going to go to Ethiopia to hear the perspective of a British aid worker rather than, you know, the people that were actually affected by this. And if anyone is uncomfortable with the idea of depicting someone who was actually experiencing famine and whether or not this British creative team were the right people to be doing that and to be telling that story, that is where you bring in consultants, that is where you bring in dramaturgs, that is where you bring in co-writers and co-directors and associates who can ensure cultural authenticity. Because you have to go back to, why are we telling this story, and what does this story deserve and require, and what other perspectives ought we be sharing here? This is something, and I'm going to mention this a lot I feel, but Come From Away probably does a more balanced job at, because even though Come From Away is a story predominantly about 9/12 and not about 9/11, it's set the day after, and it's about the events that took place in Newfoundland, Canada as a result. We also meet characters who are directly affected by the crisis. Now back to this Gen Z character in Just for One Day, because I have such issues with the way that she is written. A lot of her activism feels hollow and perhaps deliberately unlikable. She's this epitome of wokeness, the way that wokeness is perceived to be. There are jokes about the fact that of course she's vegan. There are various exchanges she has with Geldof where she unashamedly tells him that her generation would have done things a lot better. There's one moment where she completely misinterprets a lyric in the Band-Aid single, and she takes issue with him having written "Tonight, thank God it's them instead of you," ignorant of the fact that that lyric is clearly sort of admonishing the British public at the time for their complacency and not actually saying that in earnest, like, don't worry, it's not you, it's just the African people. Like, that's the whole point of the lyric. It feels like deliberate media illiteracy, and like the writers here either have come to the same misinterpretation or are just happy for her to be a scapegoat to that. Going back to the concept of a Live Aid musical, what we ought not to do as reviewers is review what we wanted the show to be, but I can't get away from this idea of what the show ought to have been and this idea of its responsibility to tell this story with authenticity and with nuance. And while watching something that tried to capture the urgency and the desperation and this riotous feel of the time, it really had no contemporary political necessity. It was quite happy to let the audience in the Old Vic Theatre off the hook. There was no admonition, there was no encouragement. A Live Aid musical ought to feel bolder, and it ought to feel rousing, and I ought to feel compelled to activism, and I didn't feel any of those things. I kept feeling as though the audience full of former rockers who are now conservative voters were going to be able to walk out of that theatre saying, gosh, wasn't Live Aid a great day? And not, gosh, wasn't that a terrible thing that they were trying to rectify? What a fantastic thing they did. How inspired we are to address the many issues currently happening in the world. It's not as though everything's magically fixed and fine now. To that end as well, one of the final lines of the show is Geldof reassuring this character representing the next generation that everything would be fine as long as we come together. And it just felt very pandering and reassuring at a time when we ought to feel compelled and incentivized and incited, and I wasn't getting any of that. I also think the whole idea of having this placeholder for the next generation on stage, amongst them being handed a ticket so she could go and watch Live Aid, was deeply heavy-handed. And this whole feel also contradicted a moment that was actually depicted in the show, when they talk about realizing partway through the concert that no one was donating because everyone was feeling too joyous in this haze of amazing music, and Geldof had to remind people of the urgency of all of this and the necessity of all of this and what it was actually about. To that end, there's a moment that's talked about in the show where the music paused so that they could show some truly harrowing footage, and they briefly talk about how that happened, and then we have a slight pause and then we move on immediately to more music. They tell us what a striking reminder of reality this was to the people in the stadium, but they don't actually show that footage on the video screens that make up this show's set because they don't want to trouble us in the theatre with having to actually feel too much. And even if actually showing that footage was deemed to be in poor taste and commodifying, you know, the horrors experienced by the people who actually suffered as a result of this famine, what we still ought to have is a moment where different people talked about their reactions to seeing it, so that we could feel a sense of the emotional weight of that, so that we could be reminded that this was about something important. It was about more than the music and Geldof being Hamlet and Jesus all at once and making it happen. Despite the fact that he keeps protesting he isn't a hero, the whole show comes across like hero worship. Because he's also the only character who has any kind of depth, who gets to experience angst. Everyone else is a caricature or just a mouthpiece for great music. And as you can probably tell, I could keep talking about this, but that was my largest issue with the show, not my only issue. Here are some other things that I think ought to be fixed. Now, I say ought to be fixed because I do think that this show can and should go on to have a further life, but it has a couple of dramaturgical issues. Let's talk about them. So I like the character of Margaret Thatcher. It gives us a little bit of variety. She represents a legitimate antagonist. She begins to overstay her welcome for me just a little bit. And while she's initially brought in as this cartoonishly villainous pinata, she becomes almost dangerously sympathetic towards the end. I don't know if that's just because I love Julie Atherton and think she's a fantastic performer, but there's a moment as her and Geldof are coming to a compromise that it almost seems as though we're building towards this whole idea of like, see, we can get along. You know, I'm not as awful as you first thought. And if there's anyone who doesn't deserve that kind of a redemption, it's Margaret Thatcher, let's be honest. I think in many ways the show treats her with kid gloves a little bit. There's also a line of dialogue that Midge says about her at one point in the first act. This was the most egregious example, but this typifies some of the problems I had with the script, where he says to Geldof, like, you can't argue with Thatcher. She's like the most stubborn person in Britain. And then that has a punchline where he's like, she hasn't met me, or like, whatever Geldof says in response. My head was too busy spinning from she's like the most stubborn person in Britain, which instantly sounded to me just like the line from Book of Mormon where they say, you're like the smartest, most deserving elder the centre's ever seen. And like maybe Midge actually said to Bob Geldof in the 80s, she's like the most stubborn person in Britain, but even if he did, just write something better and pretend that he didn't. Some of the other issues I had with the show are to do with the direction, and I like Luke Sheppard. I'm a big fan of his work. He has recently directed The Little Big Things at Soho Place. He will soon be directing the new version of Starlight Express. He directed And Juliet and My Sons Are Queer, But What Can You Do? Also in Dreams at Leeds Playhouse, I loved that as well. And he's really great at injecting levity and creating light-hearted characters and just lovely vibes. I don't know if he contends as well with something with a little more weight and dimension to it, because there were emotional beats throughout this show that were either squandered or just slightly missed. One of those was Bohemian Rhapsody, a moment which is always going to feature in a Live Aid depiction. It's an absolutely iconic performance, and up to this point in the show, the music has been used very effectively to convey different things thematically, and when we get to Bo Rap, they just do the whole song. It's very well performed, but it does feel like we just accidentally shift gears slightly and slip back into simply being an 80s Live Aid era tribute concert, because the Bo Rap doesn't really mean anything. It also kind of comes out of nowhere and doesn't build to much. It's as though they said, Bohemian Rhapsody is great, we're just not going to touch that, they're just going to perform it and everyone's going to lose their minds. And maybe they do, and maybe that's enough for this audience, but if you want that to be the defining moment of the second act, we need to have more. What actually is the defining moment of the second act is when Craig Ells as Bob Geldof performs the song I Don't Like Mondays. Between his performance and the arrangements and the dramatic context and the scene that builds into it, with Suzanne singing the introduction for him and giving him that musical encouragement, like he's about to be Grisabella singing the end of Memory. That is a well-shaped moment that carries weight because of the framing. Bo Rap, meanwhile, they don't preheat the dramatic oven for, they just send it out cold and hope that it's steaming by the time that it's done. I don't know where that metaphor came from. I don't cook often. I have no business talking and cooking metaphors. And that's not the only missed opportunity moment. The moment when they start to raise huge amounts of money and suddenly surpass £100 million raised comes in the middle of the Madonna song Get Into the Groove, and it doesn't really stir up many emotions. Get into the groove, we raised lots of money and that is nice. Like, come on. There are also two rousing vocal moments. The first of these comes when they are recording the Band-Aid single Feed the World, brackets Do They Know It's Christmas, or the other way around, and none of the artists who had agreed to do the recording have showed up to the recording studio, so it's just Bob and Midge. They are recording it together and they get frustrated and they give up, and then everyone leaves the stage, and then James Hamid walks over to the desk and picks up the sheet music and begins to sing this song, and this represents the idea of the others eventually coming back to the recording studio, and then other people join in, and then the actors playing Bob and Midge and the other people who are present for the recording come back in, and then Danielle Steer's character has a line where she says, like, Sting's walking up the road. This all just happens in the wrong order, because this should be this really stirring, welling up in the theatre emotional moment where they suddenly arrive and they suddenly come through and it all comes together. That should be inspirational, but the way that you do this, and it seems so obvious to me, is you have the two of them singing the song and they get frustrated, they give up, they say, stop, 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 this isn't going to work, this isn't going to work. Before that, Danielle Steer's character Marsha needs to have left the stage so that when they're about to give up and they're about to walk off, she runs in and they're like, no one else is coming, it's hopeless. She runs on and says, Sting's walking up the road. That signifies everyone's about to show up, and then you don't even need James to walk forwards, just stand up where he is on the bleachers for the most part. They sit on these two rows of chairs in front of the band at the back of the stage, have him stand up, a light on him, he starts singing, someone else does it as well. Way more powerful. Something similar then happens again at the end of the show. Paul McCartney's microphone goes out and there's a little bit of comedy dialogue about that and about how they tried to resolve the problem and that nothing had gone wrong up to this point. And what happens in response to that is the audience starts singing along with Paul McCartney, and it's this big emotional moment. However, the way they represent that on stage is with one individual person singing behind him. They then stop and another person starts singing. And what I feel like it ought to be is the same moment you get at the end of Les Mis, when Valjean is like close to death or like literally dying, and you have this ghost chorus coming in with, do you hear the people sing, lost in the valley of the night. Hell of a show for me to be comparing to Just for One Day, the Live Aid musical, but that has such a power to it that they need here. Either you need the whole of the cast to sort of softly come in together, like that bit in Moulin Rouge where they do, and you can tell everybody, you can tell everyone, this is your song. You know the bit. Or have them do it at the sides of the stalls in the auditorium, situating them amongst the audience, and see if you can actually incite the audience to sing along, because the audience should be the audience. Here is my other issue. They do not situate us, the crowd, to feel like we are the crowd at Live Aid. Things are either played completely in the wrong direction with the crowd on the other side of the performers, or the crowd are depicted on video screens at the back of the stage, implying that we're seeing it from the performer's perspective, which gives us a glimpse into Live Aid behind the curtain, which is what they try and do with like random throwaway lines from being like, I was the sound designer, I did the admin, I worked in the first aid tent. None of them meaningful characters, by the way. When really, we as an audience in that theatre want to feel like we're at the Live Aid concert. We want to feel situated as though we are the audience, and that never really happens. Perhaps for the first time in his career, I felt as though Luke Sheppard couldn't really get a handle on this show and everything that it was. It felt as though the exact means of storytelling and the tone kept shifting slightly, and he didn't really have a clear sense of what exactly this was. Perhaps they were just conscious of everything that this ought to be and trying to do something very conscientious with it, but in trying to tick all the right boxes, it felt as though we were still missing the point. Again, I could keep going, there's more I could say, but I want to tell you about this cast. Now, there are simply too many talents on this stage for me to mention everyone. Craig Ells plays Bob Geldof, and if I said the whole thing feels a little bit Geldof as Hamletish, it might just be because Craig does such a fantastic job here. Few other characters on this stage are afforded as much acting depth, but he does a really phenomenal job at playing Bob Geldof. We see everything that he is grappling with, and we see depth and pain and sorrow beneath this kind of sweary caricature exterior, meaning we get the sense both of the Bob Geldof that we are expecting and the way that he is publicly perceived, but also at a humanity that goes beyond that. Jack Shalhoub is also brilliant alongside as Midge, and his performance of the song Vienna is like one of the highlights of the show entirely, and we don't even get that much of the song, but it's just magnificently performed by him. I think he is an incredible rising star who needs to be watched. While we're here talking about the cast, I also want to shout out the costuming team and everyone involved, hair and makeup and wigs, because while we don't have the rest of this cast playing specific individuals, like I said, their essence is invoked with different things like details in the makeup and like different accessories, and I thought that was really cleverly done. Now, assume that absolutely everyone was giving you fantastic vocals, but in particular Danielle Steers, one of the greatest voices on the planet. I wanted far more of her vocally in this show, and I wanted more of her character Marsha. She is present throughout Band-Aid, she comes up with the name Band-Aid, and then she's very present in Live Aid and the organisation of all of that, and at one point when Geldof is set to give up on the whole thing because he is clashing with Joel Montague's character, who I'll tell you about next, she is the one who encourages him aggressively to keep going because she refuses to give up after all of the work that they've all put into it, because it's bigger than Geldof at this point. Now, had she had more character development up to this point, that would have been even more rewarding. More Danielle Steers, please, always. Other highlight vocalists, Colette Guitart. My god, sensational vocals. I don't know if they were specifically 80s, but they lended a contemporary feel to this great music that I loved. Reese Wilkinson gave some of my favourite performances. Phenomenal dancer, and just the energy that Reese brought to the stage. Joe Foster as well. The two of them were both aflame on the stage of the Old Vic Theatre. Finally, James Hamid had some soaring vocal moments. Sounded sensational. As I was saying, Joel Montague's character, we meet him in the second act. He has some great vocal moments of his own, and he brings a very different energy to the show as he is clashing with Geldof, and he's quite stubborn and uncompromising and a little bit humorless and a lot of fun. I enjoyed Jackie Clune as Suzanne and the enthusiasm that she brought from the perspective of like a character who had been at Live Aid. I feel as though rather than focusing in squarely on her in her youth and this young romantic storyline, not everything needs a romantic subplot, by the way, we could have had more different characters who had been at Live Aid and sort of following each of them rather than just going back to her each time. I also don't feel as though she needed to be played by a separate younger actress for the flashback scenes. I thought she could have played herself and just acted younger, and that still would have worked because the whole thing was kind of timeless, especially because it was framed as a recollection and no one was strictly playing themselves anyway. Of course, we have to mention Julie Atherton, who was giving you high camp Margaret Thatcher. I particularly loved the moment where she came this close to letting her hair down and giving you some actually stunning rock vocals before regaining her composure, but just wonderful work from her. And finally, Freddie Love, who, as soon as they were announced in this cast, I feel like I manifested Freddie Love performing Bohemian Rhapsody as Freddie Mercury because it just made sense to me. And it was such a rewarding performance. One of those perfect moments of the individual and the material coming together to deliver something great. And I think that concludes my thoughts about Just for One Day. Like I said, there is so much that is enjoyable in this, that is great in this even, and it's entirely feasible to go into this show and have a great time and have a 5-star experience because there is so much great here and there's so much that really wows you. I just feel as though when you consider it from a certain perspective, there is still this entirely missing dimension. But I know that not everyone is going to agree with me on this. I know that it is super crowd pleasing and a lot of people are going to have loved it, which I think is fantastic. If you enjoyed this show, if you didn't enjoy this show, whatever you thought about it, please comment down below and let me know your thoughts. I hope that you have enjoyed today's new video review. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews of all your favourite shows coming very soon. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!